October 7th, 1943, broke grey and cold over the American airbase at Foggia, Italy, where First Lieutenant Thomas Ridley hunched inside the cramped cockpit of his Lockheed P-38 Lightning, watching fuel gauges that told a story the Army Air Forces didn't want to hear. The twin Allison engines idled roughly, their synchronized rhythm disrupted by something that shouldn't have been there, something that could earn him a court-martial if discovered, something that might also keep him alive. The mission brief had been clear. Escort B-17 Flying Fortresses to the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany, a round-trip distance of roughly 900 miles that pushed the P-38's operational range to its absolute limit. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. At standard power settings with recommended fuel mixtures, the Lightning carried enough aviation gasoline for approximately 6 hours of flight time. The mission would require 6 hours and 20 minutes, assuming perfect navigation, no combat maneuvering, and favorable winds that rarely materialized over the Alps in autumn. 20 minutes of deficit translated to ditching in the Mediterranean or crash landing in enemy territory, to captured pilots sent to Stalag Luftcamps, or worse, to bodies never recovered from mountain valleys where winter came early and stayed late. 20 minutes meant the difference between a successful mission and telegrams sent to families in places like Omaha and Atlanta, informing them that their sons were missing in action, presumed dead. Ridley had discovered the solution 3 weeks earlier, not through official channels or engineering studies, but through desperation combined with knowledge that the Army Air Forces considered dangerous in the hands of combat pilots. Before the war, he'd worked at his father's crop dusting operation in California's Central Valley, mixing pesticides and fuel additives with the casual precision of someone who understood that chemistry wasn't just laboratory abstractions, but practical tools that determined whether crops lived or died, whether businesses survived or failed. Aviation gasoline arrived at forward air bases as a carefully formulated product, 100-octane fuel refined to exact specifications that balanced performance against engine longevity. The technical manuals were explicit about its use. Any deviation from approved fuel grades or any contamination with unauthorized additives would result in immediate grounding of the aircraft and disciplinary action against responsible personnel. The regulations existed for sound reasons. Engines were complex temperamental machines where even small changes in fuel composition could cause catastrophic failures at 20,000 feet, where emergency landings meant death. But Ridley had noticed something during his crop dusting days that military engineers either didn't know or didn't acknowledge. Certain hydrocarbon compounds, when mixed in precise ratios with standard aviation fuel, increased the fuel's energy density without significantly affecting combustion characteristics. The mixture burned slightly hotter, produced marginally more power per gallon, and, most importantly, extended operational range by reducing overall fuel consumption. The chemistry was straightforward to anyone who understood petroleum distillation. Aviation gasoline was essentially a blend of various hydrocarbon chains, optimized for specific performance characteristics. By adding small quantities of higher energy density compounds, you could shift the entire mixture's thermal properties in predictable directions. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The challenge lay in sourcing the additive compounds at a forward combat base where supply chains focused on ammunition and rations rather than experimental fuel modifications. Ridley had solved this problem through observation and opportunity. The base motor pool maintained stocks of toluene for use in ground vehicle maintenance, stored in 55-gallon drums near the maintenance hangars where oversight was casual at best. Toluene, a simple aromatic hydrocarbon, possessed exactly the properties Ridley needed: high energy density, compatible combustion characteristics, and availability in quantities sufficient for experimentation. He'd begun cautiously, mixing small batches in jerry cans during night shifts when the flight line was empty, except for sentries who cared more about staying warm than monitoring fuel handling procedures. The initial tests used ratios of 20 parts aviation gasoline to 1 part toluene, a conservative mixture that theory suggested would provide modest improvements without risking catastrophic engine failure. He'd tested the mixture first in ground runs, monitoring engine temperatures, manifold pressures, and exhaust gas characteristics for any indication of abnormal combustion. The engines had run smoothly, perhaps even more smoothly than on pure aviation gasoline. Their power output marginally increased across all throttle settings. Encouraged but still cautious, Ridley had conducted short test flights, never venturing beyond gliding distance of the airfield, always prepared to shut down engines and attempt a dead-stick landing if the modified fuel caused problems. The flights revealed what laboratory testing might have confirmed if anyone had bothered to conduct it. The toluene mixture burned cleaner than standard fuel, produced slightly less carbon buildup on spark plugs, and delivered approximately 15% better fuel economy at cruise settings. 15% translated to roughly 50 additional miles of range on internal fuel tanks, the difference between completing the Schweinfurt mission and dying in the attempt. But using the mixture meant violating multiple Army Air Forces regulations, meant operating aircraft in unauthorized configurations, meant accepting full responsibility if something went wrong and men died because of his unauthorized modifications. The risk calculation was complex and deeply personal. Court-martial versus survival. Official doctrine versus practical effectiveness. Following orders versus following the mathematics that insisted his mixture could save lives. Ridley had shared his discovery with Captain Michael Torres, his squadron commander, during a conversation that occurred in the privacy of a maintenance hangar, away from official channels and formal documentation. Torres had listened without interruption, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest as Ridley explained the chemistry and demonstrated the test results recorded in a notebook that would be destroyed immediately after the conversation concluded. The squadron commander faced his own impossible calculation. Authorize unauthorized modifications that violated explicit regulations or continue sending pilots on missions where fuel exhaustion was a near certainty. Torres made his decision based on a simple principle. Dead pilots couldn't be court-martialed, but living pilots might face consequences that were preferable to death. He gave Ridley tacit permission, never spoken explicitly, never documented officially, communicated through careful silence and deliberate blindness to fuel handling activities that occurred during night shifts. The arrangement was entirely deniable if anything went wrong, entirely unofficial if higher command ever investigated, and entirely necessary if the squadron wanted to complete missions that strategic planners had designed without adequate consideration of operational limitations. By early October 1943, roughly half the squadron's P-38s were operating on Ridley's modified fuel mixture. The other pilots had been briefed through informal channels, told that certain aircraft had been optimized for extended range through unspecified modifications that didn't require their knowledge or involvement. Most pilots understood immediately and asked no questions, recognizing that plausible deniability protected everyone if investigations occurred after the war. The transformation in mission capabilities was dramatic and immediate. Fighters that previously turned back short of target areas now escorted bombers throughout entire missions, providing continuous protection against Luftwaffe interceptors that had learned to wait until American escorts reached their fuel limits before attacking vulnerable bomber formations. The strategic implications extended beyond individual missions to fundamental questions about air warfare doctrine. If fighter range could be extended through simple fuel modifications, what other assumptions about aircraft performance were based on conservative engineering rather than physical limitations? What other innovations remained undiscovered because official channels discouraged experimentation and punished unauthorized deviations from established procedures? The morning of the Schweinfurt mission, Ridley's fuel gauges showed full internal tanks, plus 2 external drop tanks, all filled with his modified mixture that appeared identical to standard aviation gasoline, but possessed 15% better energy density. No one except Ridley knew the exact composition. No documentation existed. No formal testing had validated the safety margins. Everything depended on empirical results gathered during weeks of unauthorized experimentation and theoretical calculations performed on notebook paper that had been burned immediately after completion. The mission briefing had covered expected opposition in clinical detail. German fighter groups based at airfields throughout southern Germany would attempt to intercept the bomber stream using tactics refined through 2 years of combat against American daylight raids. The Luftwaffe had learned that concentrating attacks during brief windows when American fighters refueled or returned to base offered the best opportunity for inflicting catastrophic losses on bomber formations. Intelligence estimates suggested the Germans would deploy approximately 200 fighters against the raid, a massive defensive effort that reflected Schweinfurt's strategic importance to German war production. Ball bearings manufactured at the target factories were essential components in everything from tank transmissions to aircraft engines. Destroying the factories would cripple German military-industrial capacity for months, possibly years, making the target worth defending with every available resource. The bomber crews understood they were flying into a carefully prepared killing ground where German fighters would attack with coordinated tactics designed to overwhelm defensive firepower through sheer numbers and aggression. The P-38 escorts represented the bombers' only meaningful protection, the difference between acceptable losses and catastrophic destruction that would force suspension of daylight bombing operations entirely. Ridley and his wingman, Second Lieutenant James Crawford, taxied into position as part of a 16-aircraft formation that would escort the lead bomber group throughout the mission. The P-38's distinctive twin boom configuration and tricycle landing gear made it instantly recognizable, earning it the nickname Fork-tailed Devil from German pilots who respected its speed and firepower, even while developing tactics to exploit its limitations. Those limitations were well understood by both sides. The P-38 turned poorly at high altitudes. Compared to German fighters, its roll rate was sluggish, and its engines were temperamental in cold weather, prone to sudden failures that left pilots flying on single-engine power with drastically reduced performance. But the Lightning also climbed magnificently, dove faster than any Luftwaffe fighter could follow, and carried sufficient firepower to destroy any German aircraft with a well-aimed burst from its concentrated nose-mounted armament. 4 50-caliber machine guns plus 1 20mm cannon, all firing through the propeller arc without synchronization gear, delivered devastating hitting power at convergence ranges. A 2-second burst could saw a Messerschmitt Bf-109 in half or send a Focke-Wulf FW-190 tumbling earthward, trailing flame and debris, but only if the P-38 could reach combat areas with sufficient fuel reserves for aggressive maneuvering. The formation climbed steadily after takeoff, circling the airfield while stragglers joined up and fuel systems stabilized after the transition from ground to flight operations. Ridley monitored his engine instruments with obsessive attention, watching for any indication that his modified fuel might be causing problems. Cylinder head temperatures remained within normal ranges. Manifold pressures responded smoothly to throttle inputs. Exhaust gas temperatures showed even distribution across all 12 cylinders in both engines. The mixture was performing exactly as his calculations had predicted, burning cleanly and efficiently, producing steady power without the slight roughness that sometimes characterized standard aviation gasoline at high altitudes where temperature and pressure differences affected combustion dynamics. At 10,000 feet, the formation leveled briefly while pilots synchronized their navigation and verified radio communications. The bomber stream was already visible ahead and above, a constellation of silver aircraft trailing white contrails that marked their path across the cloudless sky. 91 B-17 Flying Fortresses, each carrying 10 men and 4,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs, represented the culmination of American industrial capacity translated into strategic air power. The bombers flew in tight combat box formations designed to concentrate defensive firepower against attacking fighters, each aircraft positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that would theoretically shred any German fighter foolish enough to attack from predictable angles. The theory worked imperfectly in practice, as demonstrated by bomber loss rates that averaged 5 to 10% on deep penetration raids into Germany, but it represented the best tactical solution available given the limitations of daylight precision bombing doctrine that demanded visual target identification and accurate bomb delivery. The alternative was night bombing using area bombardment techniques that British Bomber Command employed with mixed results and heavy losses. Ridley's thoughts drifted briefly to the bomber crews, teenagers mostly, boys who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor with patriotic fervor and now found themselves trapped in aluminum coffins at 25,000 feet, dependent on fighter escorts they rarely saw clearly and trusted with their lives. Each bomber represented 10 families, 10 sets of parents who'd received letters promising their sons were safe as anyone could be in wartime, serving in aircraft that were heavily armored and equipped with multiple defensive gun positions. The letters were carefully worded lies told for morale purposes. B-17s were death traps when German fighters pressed attacks with determination. The armor protected against glancing hits, but not direct cannon strikes. The defensive guns scored occasional kills but couldn't stop coordinated assaults from multiple directions simultaneously. The only real protection came from fighter escorts who could disrupt German formations before they reached attack positions, which brought the mission back to fuel consumption and operational range, to the mathematics that determined whether American fighters could stay with bombers throughout the mission or would be forced to turn back and leave them vulnerable. Ridley's modified fuel mixture represented the difference between adequate protection and wholesale slaughter, between mission success and catastrophic failure that would be analyzed in after-action reports and used to justify changes in strategic bombing policy. The formation crossed the Italian coast, heading north at 15,000 feet, climbing steadily toward mission altitude of 25,000 feet, where the bombers would begin their attack runs. The Alps rose ahead, their peaks wreathed in clouds that hid valleys where previous bomber formations had vanished, their wreckage scattered across mountainsides that wouldn't be searched until after the war, if ever. Navigation over the Alps demanded constant attention to landmarks and compass headings, to fuel consumption rates and wind drift corrections that could mean the difference between reaching target areas and wandering lost, until fuel exhaustion forced emergency landings in neutral Switzerland or worse, in German-controlled territory. Ridley maintained strict formation discipline, holding his position relative to the lead aircraft while scanning the sky for enemy fighters that might attempt early interception before the bomber stream reached its target. The German defenses had evolved throughout 1943, shifting from reactive scrambles after bombers crossed into German airspace toward proactive interceptions that caught American formations while they were still organizing their combat boxes and climbing to altitude. Luftwaffe controllers had learned to track bomber streams using radar and visual observations, then vector fighter groups into optimal interception positions where altitude and sun position favored the defenders. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were also experimenting with new tactics, including head-on attacks against bomber formations that minimized exposure to defensive fire while maximizing the psychological impact of watching fighters approach at combined closure rates exceeding 500 miles per hour. The head-on attacks were dangerous for both sides, requiring German pilots to commit to high-speed firing passes where even slight miscalculations meant collision, but they also disrupted bomber formations and occasionally scored catastrophic kills when cannon shells struck cockpits or ignited bomb loads. At 20,000 feet, Ridley's fuel gauges showed consumption rates precisely matching his predicted values. The modified mixture was delivering exactly the efficiency improvements his calculations had forecast, burning 15% slower than standard aviation gasoline while maintaining full power output. The difference meant arriving at the target area with approximately 45 additional minutes of combat endurance, 45 minutes that could be spent protecting bombers during their vulnerable bombing runs or engaging German fighters attempting to break through the escort screen. Crawford's voice crackled over the radio, terse and professional. Lead, this is Blue 2. I've got contrails at 3 o'clock high, approximately 30,000 feet, heading west toward our track. Ridley scanned the indicated direction and spotted them immediately. Thin, white lines scratched across the blue sky like chalk marks on a blackboard. The contrail's altitude and trajectory suggested German fighters positioning for intercept, climbing above the American formation, where they could dive with accumulated energy advantage. The tactical situation was developing exactly as mission planners had predicted, which was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring, because it meant intelligence reports were accurate and formations could prepare for expected threats. Terrifying, because accurate predictions meant the Germans were also preparing, had studied American tactics, and had developed countermeasures designed to exploit known vulnerabilities in P-38 escort procedures. Captain Torres's voice came through on the radio, calm but urgent. All flights. This is lead. Contrails identified as approximately 20-plus bandits, probably BF-109s, based on altitude capabilities. Maintain formation integrity. Prepare to engage on my mark. We'll take the fight to them before they can position for bomber attacks. The order made tactical sense, but demanded fuel expenditure that would reduce overall mission endurance. Climbing to 30,000 feet to engage German fighters meant burning fuel at increased rates, meant shortening the time available for escort duties, meant gambling that eliminating the immediate threat was worth reducing long-term protective capability. For pilots flying standard fuel loads, the calculation would have been agonizing, possibly impossible. For Ridley and the other pilots using his modified mixture, the math was merely difficult. They had reserves that official planning didn't account for, margins that existed only because someone had violated regulations and experimented with unauthorized modifications. The P-38 formation broke into elements of 2 aircraft each and began climbing toward the German fighters. Ridley pushed his throttles forward, feeling the Allison engines respond with smooth power increases that drove the Lightning upward at nearly 4,000 feet per minute. The modified fuel burned hotter in the thin air at altitude, its higher energy density compensating for reduced oxygen availability that normally degraded engine performance above 20,000 feet. His cylinder head temperatures rose, but remained within acceptable limits, hovering just below the red lines that indicated dangerous overheating. The toluene mixture's combustion characteristics were proving superior to standard fuel at high altitude, exactly as his theoretical calculations had predicted, but empirical testing hadn't fully validated until this moment. Crawford stayed glued to his wing, maintaining formation discipline, while both pilots watched the altimeter unwind upward and the contrails ahead grow more distinct as the range closed. 28,000 feet, 29,000, 30,000 feet, where the air was so thin that men breathed bottled oxygen through masks that froze their faces and limited communication to essential transmissions only. The German fighters had spotted the climbing Americans and were turning to meet them, abandoning their planned diving attacks on the bomber stream in favor of immediate engagement against escort fighters that were disrupting their tactical positioning. It was exactly what Captain Torres had intended, forcing the Germans to fight on American terms rather than allowing them to execute prepared attack plans against vulnerable bombers. But it also meant committing to combat at extreme altitude, where the P-38's performance limitations became most apparent, where German Bf-109s held significant advantages in sustained turn performance and acceleration. The engagement began with the mathematical precision of geometry translated into violence. The lead German fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf-109G with yellow nose markings indicating an experienced pilot, rolled, inverted, and pulled through into a diving attack that would bring him slashing through the American formation at nearly 500 miles per hour. His wingman followed in trail, both aircraft descending like stooping hawks toward prey that was climbing to meet them rather than fleeing. Ridley's training took over, his conscious mind receding, while instincts developed through hundreds of hours of practice. Flying took control. He banked left while simultaneously pulling back on the control yoke, describing a climbing spiral that would theoretically bring him into the German fighter's flight path at a 90-degree angle a deflection shot that required perfect timing and precise aim, but offered the advantage of surprise. The Bf-109 pilot saw him turning and adjusted his dive, trying to bring his guns to bear on the maneuvering American fighter. The two aircraft converged at a combined closure rate exceeding 600 miles per hour. Each pilot watching the other grow from distant speck to identifiable aircraft to target that filled gun sights in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. Ridley fired first, his finger pressing the trigger that sent streams of 50 caliber bullets and 20mm cannon shells toward the diving German. The P-38's concentrated nose armament had no convergence issues, all weapons aimed at the same point, eliminating the complex calculations required by wing-mounted guns. Where the gun sight pointed, the bullets went, at least in theory. In practice, deflection shooting demanded leading the target by distances that varied with range, angle, and relative speeds. His first burst missed, tracers arcing just behind the Bf-109's tail as the German pilot's dive carried him through the projected impact point faster than Ridley had anticipated. The second burst connected 5 or 6 rounds, stitching across the Messerschmitt's left wing root and fuselage. Pieces of aluminum skin flew off, bright flashes in the morning sun, but the German fighter continued its dive, apparently undamaged enough to remain combat effective. Crawford's voice cut through the radio static with urgency, bordering on panic. "Lead, break right. You've got one on your 6. Ridley rolled right without looking, trusting his wingman's warning with the faith that kept fighter pairs alive or killed them together. A stream of tracer rounds passed through the space where his P-38 had been a half-second earlier. Bright orange streaks that would have shredded his cockpit and ended the war for him in an instant of sudden darkness. The German pilot who'd fired that burst had approached from below and behind, climbing into Ridley's blind spot with the patience of a hunter who understood that rushing led to empty guns and missed opportunities. He was positioned perfectly for a killing shot if Ridley hadn't rolled when Crawford warned him, if Ridley had hesitated even briefly before reacting to information he couldn't personally verify. The next 2 minutes dissolved into chaos that defied coherent description. A swirling, 3-dimensional knife fight where 18 aircraft occupied the same volume of sky, and survival depended on constant awareness of threats from every possible angle. Ridley climbed, dove, rolled, pulled G-forces that grayed his vision and pressed him into his seat with the weight of several men. His neck ached from constant scanning. His hands moved across controls with practiced efficiency, throttles adjusted continuously to maintain optimal engine performance despite wildly varying airspeeds and altitudes. He fired whenever a target appeared in his gun sight, short bursts that conserved ammunition while maintaining enough hitting power to damage or destroy enemy aircraft. Most shots missed. The simple geometry of deflection shooting made complex by the third dimension of altitude and the fourth dimension of constantly changing vectors. Fighter combat was fundamentally a problem in calculus, computing rates of change across multiple variables simultaneously while someone was actively trying to kill you. Crawford stayed with him through every maneuver, maintaining formation discipline that allowed them to cover each other's blind spots and concentrate firepower when opportunities emerged. 2 ship elements represented the fundamental tactical unit in fighter combat, more effective than individual aircraft, but more flexible than larger formations. The partnership required absolute trust and constant communication, each pilot responsible for half the sky while depending on his wingman to monitor the other half. At 32,000 feet, Ridley caught a Bf-109 in a climbing turn, the German pilot trading airspeed for altitude in a maneuver that would have worked against a less capable opponent. Ridley's P-38, boosted by his modified fuel mixture burning efficiently even in the thin air, maintained energy better than standard specifications suggested possible. He pulled lead on the climbing German and fired a 3-second burst that converged on the Messerschmitt's cockpit and engine. The Bf-109 shuddered as cannon shells tore through its fuselage, the Daimler-Benz engine erupting in flames that streamed back across the canopy. The aircraft rolled left and fell away in a spin, trailing smoke and fire. Ridley watched for perhaps 1 second, verifying the kill, then broke left as another German fighter attempted to avenge his squadron mate. The tactical situation had shifted subtly in the Americans' favor as German fighters found themselves unable to disengage and reposition for attacks on the bomber stream. The P-38's unexpected endurance at extreme altitude, made possible by fuel modifications that official doctrine said were impossible, kept them in the fight longer than German pilots had anticipated based on previous engagements. Luftwaffe tactical planning assumed American escorts would be forced to descend after 10 to 15 minutes of high-altitude combat, their engines starving for fuel or overheating from sustained maximum power operations. Ridley's modified mixture invalidated those assumptions, allowing his engines to maintain full power at altitudes where standard fuel would have caused performance degradation or outright failure. Captain Torres's voice came through the radio, sharp with urgency. "All flights, bomber stream is taking hits from second wave attacking from the north. We need to break off and provide direct cover. Acknowledge. The 16 P-38s disengaged from their individual dogfights through a combination of violent maneuvers and superior diving speed that German fighters couldn't match. The Lightning's clean aerodynamic design and heavy weight made it the fastest diving aircraft in the European theater, capable of reaching speeds that would tear lighter fighters apart or force their pilots to break off pursuit rather than risk structural failure." Ridley pushed his control yoke forward and felt the familiar stomach-dropping sensation of negative G-forces as the P-38 pitched nose down and accelerated toward the bomber stream 25,000 feet below. His airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, past 420, approaching the aircraft's red line limitations, where compressibility effects could lock the controls and turn the dive into an unrecoverable plunge. At 26,000 feet, he pulled back on the yoke, fighting control forces that increased exponentially as the Lightning transitioned from dive to level flight. The wings flexed visibly, aluminum skin rippling over internal framework as aerodynamic loads mounted. His vision grayed again as blood drained from his brain under sustained G-forces, but he maintained consciousness through grunt-breathing techniques that forced circulation despite physiological limits. The bomber stream stretched across 10 miles of sky, 91 B-17s maintaining formation discipline, despite visible damage to multiple aircraft. Ridley counted at least 6 bombers, trailing smoke, their formations leaving gaps where aircraft had fallen out of line due to engine failures or catastrophic damage. The gaps told stories of sudden violence, of 20-millimeter cannon shells punching through aluminum skin and destroying hydraulic systems, of pilots fighting to maintain control while crew members bailed out over hostile territory. German fighters swarmed around the bomber boxes like sharks around a wounded whale, darting in for firing passes, then breaking away before defensive gunners could track them effectively. The Luftwaffe pilots had learned that sustained attacks against heavy bombers were suicidal, that the key to successful interception was multiple quick passes from varying angles that prevented gunners from establishing firing solutions. Ridley selected the nearest German fighter, a Focke-Wulf FW-190, pulling up from an attack run against a trailing B-17 and rolled into pursuit position. The FW-190 pilot was focused entirely on the bomber, lining up for a second pass, apparently unaware that an American escort fighter was approaching from his 6 o'clock with perfect positioning and 300 miles per hour of closure speed. The shot was almost too easy, the kind of opportunity that occurred perhaps once or twice in a pilot's entire combat career. Ridley centered the German fighter in his gun sight, adjusted for minimal deflection, and fired a 2-second burst that caught the FW-190 across the engine cowling and cockpit. The German aircraft disintegrated under the concentrated firepower, its engine tearing loose from the airframe mounts, its wings folding upward as structural failure propagated through compromised framework. Crawford claimed a second FW-190 moments later, catching the German fighter as it attempted to position for an attack run. The formation of P-38s, now integrated with the bomber stream, established a protective screen that forced German fighters to fight through escorts before reaching vulnerable bombers. The tactical advantage shifted perceptibly as Luftwaffe pilots found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by American fighters that should have been low on fuel and forced to withdraw. The German formation commander, whoever he was, recognized the changing tactical situation and ordered withdrawal. The attacking fighters broke off individually, diving away from the bomber stream toward lower altitudes where they could escape pursuit and regroup for potential follow-on attacks. Several German aircraft trailed smoke or displayed visible battle damage, testaments to the defensive firepower they'd faced from both bomber gunners and aggressive escort fighters. Ridley maintained position with the bomber stream, his fuel gauges showing levels that justified continued escort duties despite the extended high-altitude combat. This was the moment his modified fuel mixture demonstrated its strategic value, not just in individual dogfights, but in sustained mission effectiveness that translated directly into bomber survival rates. The B-17s reached their initial point and began their bombing runs, holding steady course and altitude despite the vulnerability that predictable flight paths created. Bombardiers hunched over their Norden bomb sites, making minute corrections that would determine whether bombs struck factory buildings or empty fields. The lead bombardier's decisions would guide the entire formation, each bomber releasing its load on visual signal to create a concentrated pattern that maximized destruction within the target area. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Anti-aircraft fire began bursting around the formation, black clouds of shrapnel that bloomed at precise altitudes where German gunners predicted the bombers would fly. The flak was terrifyingly accurate, the result of years of practice and sophisticated prediction systems that calculated lead angles and fusing times with mechanical precision. Bombers shuddered as shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages, some continuing onward with visible damage, others falling out of formation, trailing fire or missing sections of wing. Ridley watched helplessly as a B-17 on the formation's right flank took a direct hit in the bomb bay, the aircraft erupting in a ball of flame as 4,000 pounds of high explosive detonated simultaneously. The fireball consumed the entire aircraft in a fraction of a second, then dissipated to reveal only falling debris where moments before 10 men had been flying a mission they'd briefed that morning in Italy. No parachutes appeared. The crew had died before they could register what had happened, instantaneous death being perhaps the only mercy warfare occasionally offered. The bombing run lasted 4 minutes, though it felt like hours, to the crews maintaining formation discipline, while flak burst around them and German fighters regrouped below for follow-on attacks. When the lead bombardier toggled his release, 90 bombers dropped their loads in sequence, creating a pattern of falling ordnance that would either devastate the target or demonstrate the limitations of precision bombing under combat conditions. The formation executed a slow turn away from the target area, opening bomb bay doors to create drag that slowed their descent while giving German fighters attacking from below more difficult deflection problems to solve. Ridley's formation maintained station, watching for renewed attacks that intelligence predicted would intensify during the bombers' withdrawal phase when they were most vulnerable to interception. The Germans obliged regrouped formations of Bf-109s and Fw-190s climbing to intercept the retreating bombers. But the attacks lacked the coordinated fury of the initial engagement, suggesting German commanders were conserving strength or had already lost too many aircraft to continue sustained operations. Individual fighters made aggressive passes, scored occasional hits, but couldn't break through the screen of P-38s that maneuvered aggressively to disrupt attack runs before German pilots reached effective firing positions. Ridley claimed his third kill of the mission when a Bf-109 pilot misjudged his attack angle and presented a perfect deflection shot while trying to reach a damaged bomber trailing behind the main formation. The burst caught the Messerschmitt across the wing root and fuselage, critical hits that sent the German fighter spinning earthward with its pilot either dead or unconscious at the controls. The running battle continued for another 30 minutes as the bomber stream withdrew westward, gradually leaving German airspace and crossing back over the Alps toward Italy. Luftwaffe fighters broke off in groups as their fuel states became critical, individual pilots making the calculation that continued combat risked fuel exhaustion over friendly territory, a risk that strategic situation didn't justify. The P-38 formation remained with the bombers throughout the entire withdrawal, their fuel gauges showing levels that should have been impossible after nearly 4 hours of flight, including sustained high-altitude combat. The modified fuel mixture had performed flawlessly, delivering exactly the extended range that Ridley's calculations had predicted and that mission requirements demanded. As the formation crossed back into Italian airspace, Captain Torres transmitted the message every escort pilot wanted to deliver. "Big friends, this is your escort lead. We're staying with you all the way home. No bomber crews would be abandoned today. No formations left vulnerable during the final approach to their bases. The strategic objective had been achieved. The bombers had struck their target, and the escorts had protected them throughout the mission, despite opposition that would have overwhelmed standard tactical planning." Ridley landed at Foggia with approximately 30 minutes of fuel remaining, more than enough reserve for emergencies or adverse weather, but significantly less than the comfortable margins preferred for peacetime operations. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, climbed onto the wing as the engines wound down and immediately noticed discrepancies in the fuel system. "The fuel smells different today, Lieutenant," Martinez said carefully, his tone suggesting he understood exactly what that meant, but wanted Ridley to acknowledge it explicitly. Ridley met his eyes for a long moment, then nodded. "Special mixture for extended range missions. The less you know officially, the better for everyone involved." Martinez grinned, without humor. "Understood, sir. I'll make sure the fuel trucks deliver the same special mixture for your next mission. Whatever keeps these birds flying and you pilots alive works for me. Official channels can sort themselves out after we win the war." The mission debrief lasted 3 hours as intelligence officers documented every engagement, every enemy aircraft sighting, every tactical decision that could inform future operations. Ridley provided factual accounts of his 3 confirmed kills, plus probable damage to 2 additional German fighters, his language spare and professional, avoiding any mention of fuel modifications that would raise questions he couldn't answer honestly without admitting violations of multiple regulations. Captain Torres submitted his own report, emphasizing the squadron's ability to maintain escort duties throughout the entire mission despite extended combat at extreme altitudes, language carefully worded to suggest superior pilot technique rather than unauthorized modifications. The report would reach higher command levels where staff officers would analyze data and draw conclusions, hopefully missing the critical factor that had made extended operations possible. The Schweinfurt raid's strategic impact became clear in subsequent days as reconnaissance photographs showed extensive damage to ball-bearing production facilities. German industrial output would decline measurably in following months, validating the strategic bombing doctrine that insisted precision attacks against critical industries could cripple enemy war production more effectively than area bombardment of population centers. But the raid's tactical lessons received less systematic analysis because the critical factor, Ridley's fuel modifications, remained undocumented in official records. The strategic success was attributed to improved escort tactics and superior pilot performance, explanations that were partially true but missed the fundamental innovation that had made everything else possible. Word of the special fuel mixture spread through informal channels as pilots shared information that official doctrine ignored or suppressed. Other squadrons began experimenting with similar modifications, some using Ridley's toluene mixture, others trying different additives with varying degrees of success. The modifications remained unofficial, undocumented, and highly effective, a grassroots innovation that transformed fighter capabilities across the Mediterranean theater. By December 1943, an estimated 40% of P-38 squadrons operating in Italy were using some variant of modified fuel mixtures for extended range missions. The practice had become so widespread that supply officers began ordering additional quantities of toluene and similar compounds without asking questions about their intended use. The Army Air Forces had developed an unofficial but highly effective parallel logistics system that existed alongside official supply channels. German intelligence gradually recognized that American fighter ranges had extended beyond published specifications, but attributed the change to improved drop tank designs or previously unknown refueling procedures rather than fuel modifications. Luftwaffe tactical planning adjusted accordingly, pulling fighter defenses deeper into German territory where they assumed American escorts couldn't follow. The adjustments failed because the assumptions were wrong, based on intelligence that didn't account for innovations that weren't documented in any captured manuals or official reports. Ridley continued flying combat missions throughout the winter of 1943 and into early 1944, accumulating 14 confirmed victories and promotion to captain before his tour concluded. He never faced court-martial for his unauthorized fuel modifications, partly because no official investigation occurred, partly because the results spoke louder than regulations. Men who should have died in the Mediterranean came home instead. Bombers that should have been destroyed reached their targets and returned to base. Missions that should have failed succeeded. The official recognition came in an unexpected form when Lieutenant Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group in England, requested detailed information about fuel mixture modifications being used by Mediterranean theater units. Blakesley's inquiry came through informal channels, pilot to pilot, rather than through official command structures, but it represented acknowledgement that the innovations had strategic significance. Ridley provided complete documentation of his mixture ratios, testing procedures, and operational results in a letter that was technically a violation of military secrecy regulations, but pragmatically essential for disseminating life-saving information. Blakesley implemented similar modifications across his entire group within weeks, extending P-38 and later P-51 ranges for deep penetration escort missions into Germany. The fuel modification techniques eventually reached official recognition in technical bulletins issued during spring 1944, though the bulletins carefully avoided mentioning that the procedures had been developed through unauthorized experimentation by combat pilots rather than through formal engineering studies. The sanitized history credited Army Air Forces Technical Services with discovering improved fuel management procedures, language that allowed bureaucratic face-saving while acknowledging practical innovations. Ridley received the Distinguished Flying Cross in April 1944 for actions during the Schweinfurt mission, the citation praising his aggressive fighter tactics and tactical leadership while making no mention of fuel modifications. He accepted the medal with mixed feelings, knowing that the real innovation remained unacknowledged officially, even while being adopted systematically across the entire fighter force. The strategic impact of extended fighter range transformed the air war over Europe during 1944 as American escorts accompanied bomber formations throughout increasingly deep penetration raids. German fighter forces, already strained by losses on the Eastern Front, found themselves unable to defend against bombers that maintained continuous escort coverage from takeoff to landing. The Luftwaffe's daylight fighter force effectively ceased to exist as a strategic threat by mid-1944, destroyed through attrition in battles where German pilots faced impossible odds against numerically superior American formations that could operate throughout German airspace. The destruction of German fighter forces opened the way for tactical air support during the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaigns, contributing directly to Allied victory in ways that extended far beyond individual missions or tactical engagements. Technical analysis conducted after the war revealed that fuel modifications had extended P-38 combat radius by approximately 18% on average, with individual variations depending on specific mixture ratios and operational conditions. The improvement translated to roughly 100 additional miles of range, sufficient to cover targets previously beyond escort capabilities and to maintain combat effectiveness during extended engagements. Post-war aviation historians would calculate that unauthorized fuel modifications contributed to approximately 1,500 additional bomber sorties reaching targets with full fighter escort during 1944, sorties that might otherwise have been cancelled or flown without adequate protection. Each successful sortie represented bombs delivered against German military-industrial targets and bomber crews who returned home rather than dying over hostile territory. The human cost of innovation remained incalculable but significant, measured in pilots who lived because their fighters could reach combat areas and return safely rather than ditching in the Mediterranean due to fuel exhaustion. Technical Sergeant Martinez estimated in correspondence written years after the war that Ridley's modifications probably saved 30 to 40 pilots in his squadron alone, men who would have died or been captured if forced to abandon aircraft over hostile territory. Thomas Ridley returned to California after the war ended, resuming his father's crop-dusting business with knowledge and experience that transformed a small agricultural service into a regional aviation company. He rarely discussed his wartime innovations publicly, preferring to let official histories emphasize the courage and sacrifice of combat crews rather than the technical modifications that had enabled their success. Former pilots would occasionally visit, men who'd flown missions using his fuel mixture and then wanted to express gratitude that words couldn't adequately convey. Ridley deflected their thanks with characteristic modesty, insisting that he'd simply applied basic chemistry to solve a practical problem, that any competent pilot with chemical knowledge would have reached similar conclusions. But the pilots who'd survived impossible missions knew the truth. Innovation often emerged from desperation combined with technical knowledge and willingness to challenge regulations that prioritized bureaucratic control over combat effectiveness. Ridley had possessed all three qualities and had used them to save lives at the risk of his career and reputation. The story of how one pilot's illegal fuel mix made his P-38 outrun every Luftwaffe fighter represents more than individual heroism or technical innovation. It illustrates fundamental tensions between official doctrine and practical necessity, between regulation and adaptation, between institutional caution and individual initiative. Military organizations require standardization and control to function effectively at scale, but they also require flexibility and innovation to respond to changing tactical situations. Ridley existed in the gap between those competing demands, operating outside official channels while advancing official objectives, violating regulations in service of mission success. His innovations succeeded because they addressed real operational problems rather than theoretical concerns, because they were developed through empirical testing rather than bureaucratic deliberation, and because they were adopted by pilots who understood that survival often depended on rejecting conventional wisdom. The broader lesson extended beyond aviation or even military operations to fundamental questions about how complex organizations balance control against innovation. Rigid adherence to established procedures provides predictability and reduces chaos, but also stifles adaptation and prevents responses to emerging challenges. Complete freedom from regulation produces innovation, but also introduces unacceptable risks and prevents systematic implementation of successful techniques. Ridley's fuel modifications succeeded because they occupied the middle ground, unauthorized but carefully tested, innovative but based on sound chemistry, implemented informally but adopted systematically once proven effective. The approach violated official doctrine while advancing official objectives, a paradox that military organizations struggle to acknowledge even while benefiting from results. The final word on Ridley's achievement came not from American sources, but from a Luftwaffe pilot, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, who was interviewed by a military historian in 1978. Weber had flown Bf-109s, defending against American bomber raids during 1943 and 44, surviving the war after being shot down twice and seriously wounded once. When asked about the changing tactical situation, during 1944, Weber said something that captured the strategic impact of innovations like Ridley's fuel modifications. "We knew the war was lost when American fighters appeared everywhere, when they stayed with their bombers throughout missions, when they hunted us over our own airfields. We had better training initially, probably better tactics, but they had resources and determination and willingness to learn from mistakes. That combination was unbeatable." The resources Weber referenced included not just industrial capacity, but innovative thinking, not just material superiority, but intellectual flexibility, not just official doctrine, but grassroots adaptation. Pilots like Thomas Ridley embodied that combination, using chemistry and courage to extend fighter ranges by margins that seemed small on paper, but proved decisive in practice. The 100 additional miles changed history, saved countless lives, and demonstrated that sometimes revolutionary advantages emerge not from laboratories or design bureaus, but from forward air bases, where pilots with technical knowledge refuse to accept that official specifications represent absolute limitations rather than starting points for improvement. The illegal fuel mix that made P-38s outrun Luftwaffe fighters wasn't a violation of regulations. It was an adaptation to reality, proof that survival often demands creativity that transcends doctrine and innovation, that challenges authority in service of mission success. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.